Barrie Schwortz was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project, the team that conducted the first in-depth scientific examination of the Shroud, research with experts around the world. He is editor and founder of the Shroud of Turin website, www.shroud.com, the oldest, largest, and most extensive Shroud resource on the internet, with more than 10 million visitors from over 160 countries. In 2009, he founded the nonprofit Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, Incorporated, to which he donated the website and his extensive Shroud resources to preserve and maintain these materials and make them available for continuing research and study. He co-authored the Turin Shroud, the Illustrated Evidence, and has appeared on every major broadcast and cable television network. Please put your hands together and welcome our speaker, Barrie Schwartz.
Good job. Well, can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay, good. Well, thank you so much. It's great to be back here. It's my second year at the University Series. Because time is short and I talk a lot, I make note of my initials. Okay. See, it always takes a few seconds for people to figure that one out. I said that in front of an archbishop one time, and afterwards I was so embarrassed I went up and I said, "Please forgive me, I hope I didn't offend you." And he said, "No, I thought it was hilarious." A good one. Okay, I always start my talks the same way, so I'm going to be true to form, and I'm going to start this talk by telling you that before I'm finished tonight, you're going to know what a nice Jewish boy like me is doing involved with the most important relic of Christianity. Okay, so at the end, don't let me forget, I'll give you the answer to that question. So, to start with, the first question I always get is, well, how did you get involved with this? Well, I was a professional photographer for 44 years. And back in the days, in the 70s, I was just up the road a piece in Santa Barbara where I had my studio. And I had been contracted to work on, I was a technical photographer, not portraits and weddings as much as scientific, medical, technical, and advertising, you know, corporate stuff. But I got contracted to do a project for Los Alamos National Laboratories. And of course, you know what they do, atomic bombs. And so I did this project. They contracted me for 7 months. And I'd love to tell you more about what it was about, but because you already know it was about atomic bombs. But if I tell you any more, since it was so secret, I have to kill you, and there's too many of you, so we'll just leave it at that I did 7 months of work with Los Alamos on a thing about atomic bombs. At the end of that 7 months, project ended. I was back in my studio in Santa Barbara. Phone rings, same gentleman, Don Devan, calls me up again, and you know, when you're self-employed, when the phone rings, you go, aha, maybe another job. And Don said, listen, Barrie, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin? And I kind of laughed, and I said, but Don, I'm Jewish. And Don laughed, and he said, so am I, remember? Don was one of the other Jewish members on the team. Well, Don said, look, these guys have taken a photograph of the Shroud, put it into this device that sort of extracts the image into vertical space, and determined that the image on the Shroud has depth or dimensional or spatial or 3D information encoded into it. And I said, yeah, right, because you can't do that with photography and you can't do that with artworks. Now, in more recent years, a couple of people who were really professional artists used the Shroud as a model and were able to get a little bit of that encoded in. But you show me a medieval guy who would have even thought of it, let alone been able to do that, and it's just ludicrous. Obviously, I am now convinced the Shroud's authentic, but I didn't start out that way. So when Don said, so do you want to be on this team? I said, no. No, I don't want to be on that. I didn't want to get involved with something I thought was like this religious thing. And so Don said, well, look, let me bring you some literature. And you can look at it, and then you can decide. I said, fair enough. So he brought me a whole stack of tracts from the Holy Shroud Guild. which was exactly what I was afraid of, you know, and that was 4 priests in New York, Esopus, New York, that were promoting the shroud in the United States from the 50s forward. So that didn't help, but it was those image properties. That's what hooked me. So it was my scientific curiosity that said, you know, maybe I will do this. A few months into the project, some guys from Jet Propulsion Lab joined the team. Now I was excited because being a technical photographer, one of the guys that joined us from the Jet Propulsion Lab was Don Lynn, may he rest in peace. He was head of imaging on Voyager and Viking and Mariner and Galileo, and he was my hero instantly on that team. He was a good Catholic man too, and I remember saying to him, because I was vacillating, I was thinking, maybe I'm going to quit. And I said that, I said, gee, Don, what's a nice Jewish boy like me doing on this team? Kind of tongue-in-cheek. But I was sincere. I was thinking of quitting, and Don looked at me and said, well, apparently you've forgotten that the man in question was a Jew. And I said, no, that's about all I knew about Jesus. I was raised in a half-Jewish, half-Catholic neighborhood, Italian neighborhood, so I knew Jesus was a Jew, but that's about all I knew about Jesus. And he said, so you don't think God would want one of his chosen people on our team? Then I laughed. I said, well, no, I never thought that. And then he gave me what perhaps now is the best advice I've ever been given in my whole life. He said to me, go to Turin, stop your complaining, do the best job you can do. God doesn't tell us in advance what the plan is, but one day you'll know. And those are the words that kept me on that team. And here it is all these years later, and of course in retrospect, looking back, I know that was God speaking to me through Don's voice. Because God had a plan for me that I could never have foreseen. Could you imagine telling me 35 years ago, someday you'll travel the world lecturing on the Shroud of Turin? I would have laughed in your face. I had no intentions of doing this. This was never my idea. As a matter of fact, now I'm planning to write a book, and I already have the title. I don't have the book written, but I have the title. The title will be, This Was Not My Idea. Because it wasn't. But now I understand why I'm here. And at the end, I'll kind of give you the answer to the question I posed. So, because time is short and I really want to get into it, what I'm going to do, now that you know how I got involved, because obviously after Don Lynn, the guy from JPL, said that to me, I stayed on the team and have never regretted it since. So what I'm going to do this evening is give you a kind of a brief introduction to the Shroud. Then I'm going to take you behind the scenes of what we did in 1978, because, you know, when you think scientific exam, you think of a laboratory and stainless steel and white enamel, you know, a laboratory. And I'm going to show you exactly what we were up against to examine this 2,000-year-old relic in the Royal Palace of Turin, a 400-year-old, creaky old, dusty old building. I'm going to take you behind the scenes, and then I will then go into a little bit of just a few minutes of telling you the impact this has had on my life, because I think that is really kind of the surprise of my life, was to get involved with this and have it lead me where it's led me. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask the folks who are in control of the lights if they can at least kill this bank and perhaps even cut that back bank in half. Because although it's wonderful for you to look at me, what's going to be really important is what's going to be up on the screen and not me. And if we can do that, can we do the back bank, do you think, in half? That still leaves plenty of light for everybody to get up and move around when they need to, but it'll make it much better for you to see the screen. Now, if all goes well and I push the button, the slide should advance. What do you know? Technology at its finest. Okay, so what is the Shroud of Turin? It's a 14.5-foot long, 3.5-foot wide sheet of ancient woven linen. And obviously it bears the image of a crucified man, which is very hard to see on this photograph right now. But look at these dimensions. These dimensions make no sense in the modern world. 14.5 by 3.5 is sort of meaningless until you start looking at the unit of measure used back in the 1st century. It was called the cubit. What's interesting about the cubit is, when I did my research, I found there were like 30 different measurements called a cubit. But the Syrian cubit would be 8 and 2. That's the dimension. very close to 8 by 2, which is a Syrian cubit, something that most of us didn't know anything about. So there is something significant about the size, although it doesn't mean much to us today. So the problem with the shroud is it's got all these marks and burns and things that are on it that make it very difficult to see what's really important. And oh, by the way, the first question I always get when people look at this, how do you get an image? And if you look close, you'll see there's a face, there are the hands and the feet, and the back of the head, the shoulders, all the way down to the feet on that side. How do you get that kind of an image onto a sheet of cloth? And this Della Rovere painting shows you. Now, this was a Jewish burial shroud. You know, I have some of my Christian friends, not Catholics, but Christian friends, who say, well, the shroud can't be real because in the Gospels it says it was linen strips. Yeah, well, if I bind a body into a shroud like this, if I go to move the body, what's going to happen? It's going to fall right off the body. Cloth is just going to fall off. Jewish law says you bind the body into the shroud using linen strips. That says right that in the Gospels. As a matter of fact, there's also a second cloth, which I'm not going to get into tonight, but it says that in the Gospels, the second cloth folded and separate from the other, and that's what guarantees, in my mind, this is an authentic Jewish burial, because that second cloth was the face cloth they put over Jesus when they took him off the cross and carried him to the tomb with that. It had his blood and pleural fluids on it, and Jewish law reveres the blood and says it must be buried with the body. So when I hear there was a second cloth in the tomb, that tells me this really is a Jewish burial. Christians, Muslims do not have the same thing about blood, so this to me makes it an authentic Jewish burial, which is of course what would have been afforded to Jesus. Now, nobody knew anything about the Shroud of Turin until 1898 when this gentleman, nobody outside of northern Italy, let's say, when this gentleman, Secondo Pia, used that little camera on the right there, which is almost as big as me. You'll see a photo later to prove that. He used this camera and he made the first photograph of the shroud. Until then, it was rather obscure and just something known locally in the northern part of Italy and perhaps in western France. And this is what he saw when he looked through his ground glass. He had one of those big cameras with the hood, you know, the dark cloth. You have to look at the ground glass on the back. This is what his eyeballs saw. But of course, in 1898, Kodak hadn't invented color film yet. And so what his negative showed was this. Now, all of a sudden, what was very obscure becomes much clearer. And now you can see the face, the arms, the legs, the knees, all the way to the feet, the back of the head, shoulders, all the way down to the feet on that side. But rather than make you crane your neck, let's make it easier. Let's look at half the shroud at a time. Let's have the man stand before us. And now you can see much more clearly. Look at the face. Notice the cheekbones are both swollen, one more so than the other. As a matter of fact, look at the bloodstains covering the head. You know, artists over the centuries have always depicted the crown of thorns in a circlet, much the way they depicted Roman emperors in the first century, a laurel wreath. So the artist just took that, changed the laurel wreath to thorns, and painted that. Another reason I know that the shroud isn't a painting is he's naked. Have you ever seen a depiction of Jesus in the nude? Artists have the artistic freedom or artistic license to paint a modesty cloth so it wouldn't be offensive to the people of their times. And yet this man is naked. Now, it just so happens his hands are in the right spot. But still, no artist would ever depict somebody like this. And let's continue looking. The bloodstains on the forehead, the face, that thing under the chin, that horizontal line, that's just a crease in the cloth. And we smoothed the shroud out and we put it on this table and held it in place with magnets, but that crease was so folded in and so pressed in, if you will, because they rolled the shroud up for centuries, that it pressed it in. We could not get it out, so there's a shadow there, and that looks white. It's dark over here. You can see it's just a crease, but over here it looks white on the black and white negative view. Continuing on, we have a blood stain from a spear wound in his side and a blood flow from that. All of these things down either side are burns and scorches from a fire in 1532 that severely damaged the cloth. And those triangular shaped things are patches sewn in by the Poor Clare sisters in 1534. Now, in 2002, this was all removed. All these patches were removed. They scraped away the char around the burn holes. They vacuumed it. They stretched it out, and it's 7 centimeters longer than it was when I photographed it. They slightly distorted the image, and then they took the backing sheet off of it, put a wider backing sheet behind it, consequently making the image less contrasty and even harder to see today. I'll show you at the end what it looks like now. Continuing on, we have blood flows down the arms. You can clearly see them, and at the back of the wrist, or the hand, we see an exit wound of a crucifixion wound. Now, artists have always depicted Jesus with a nail right through the center of the palm, right? That's typically what we see. Almost every artwork depicting the crucifixion shows Jesus with a nail in the middle of his palm. But he was a pretty strong man. And any strong man, especially under such duress after being tortured so long, might have been able to rip his hands free. Now, if you're a Roman soldier assigned having to crucify somebody, it's not a fun job. And so you're going to want to accomplish it as efficiently and as quickly as possible so you can get it over with. If you take your thumb and your little finger and you put them together like this, and notice that there's a groove between the two little fleshy parts of your palm. That groove is called the thenar furrow, in case there's any medical folks in the room. If you grab somebody's hand by these two fingers, do this, now you got a perfect place to put a nail and secure it, and it's a little closer to the wrist where he's not going to be able to pull his hand loose. Now, it's only an inch below the center of the palm, okay? But skeptics say, well, it's not right. No, it's actually more forensically accurate here than on any of the artistic depictions you've ever seen. And there is no difference in the Greek or the Aramaic for the middle of the palm and 1 inch below that. So there's nothing about this that's incorrect. If anything, it's more accurate than any painting you've ever seen. There's one of the patches there, and there's also water stains. That fire in 1532, there were no fire extinguishers, so they just dumped some water on it, causing water stains. And you can see them. They're kind of diamond-shaped. There's some here. There's some at the top. There's some in the corners here. And these water stains are permanent. And so they only add to the confusion of looking at this image. And we can see blood stains at the feet from the crucifixion nails now. My Catholic friends would love to believe that there were 3 nails used. It's quite possible that there were 3 nails used. And again, the 3 kind of ties to the Trinity. But the only remains of crucifixion victims ever found, and there are now 2 remains that have been found, both Jewish crucifixion victims. The nail went through the side of the ankle, implying that there was 2 nails, 1 for each foot. And so the forensic guys have been arguing about this. Shroud research has been arguing about this for as long as I've been involved. And I always turn to them and say, okay, well, I can understand why, technically you want to argue about these things, but what difference does it make? Look what they did to him. Does it matter if it was 3 or 4 nails? Not really. But the shroud doesn't give us enough information to say with any scientific certainty whether it was 3 or 4 nails. Let's look at the dorsal view, the back. Starting with the blood stains on the head. Now look, I already told you that circlet that artists have always depicted, that wasn't very realistic. Do you think that they told a Roman soldier to go and weave a pretty little crown for this criminal they were about to execute? Of course not. They took a nasty thorn bush and smashed it onto his head, causing blood stains and wounds covering the entire scalp, and that's what we see on the shroud. You can see it here from the top of the head all the way down. There are blood flows covering his head. It was actually worse than the little circlet of thorns that artists have depicted. Here's another clever thing that because skeptics say a medieval artist did this. So here's another thing a medieval artist had to do, besides having to invent photography 700 years before its actual invention. This guy also had to have figured out gravity, because I showed you on the front there was a spear wound. Well, when you lay somebody down and the blood flows from that, it pulled at the small of his back thanks to gravity. You think an artist would have thought of that in medieval times? I wouldn't have thought of it now. And yet there you go, there's a blood flow that goes across the small of the back, from the spear wound itself. Again, too authentic. All of the forensic pathologists who've studied the shroud say this is absolutely like a crime scene. It's as accurate as they have ever seen. It's 100% forensically accurate. Look, all the way down now, look at the scourge marks on the back. I didn't show you on the front. I probably should have. I forgot to. If you're standing behind somebody and whipping them, and you take a baby step closer, what's going to happen to those thongs of the whip? Are going to come around, and they're going to hit the front of the body. And the man of the shroud has scourge wounds on the front of his body as well as the back of his body. Have you ever seen an artist depict it that way? No. Because this is for real, and this is not an artwork. And you can see they literally beat him from head to toe, because all the way down his calves, down to his ankles, he's got scourge wounds. And as a matter of fact, we get to the feet, and again, we can't tell if it's one or two nails. But what we do have, if you look closely, this one on the left here is the entire sole of the foot, a bloody footprint. Now, there's only one way for that to have occurred, is if one leg was bent. You can't lay on your back and put your feet flat without bending your knee. So we know that this knee was bent. And here we see the back of an ankle. So we see the heel. The toes are pointing away from us, so we can't see much of the foot. We're seeing the back of the ankle. Here's his back, and when I say there's scourge wounds, I think you can see it reasonably well. You can see these sort of dumbbell-shaped markings, and they literally cover his body, as I've shown you. This is what a Roman flagrum looks like. Now, I know you saw Mel Gibson's movie. Mel Gibson didn't use this. He used hooks called scorpioni. The Romans did use that. That was capital punishment. That killed you. They didn't want him dead on the cross. They didn't want him dead on the ground. They wanted him dead on the cross. So this is what they used. This would have been considered, and remember, Pilate wasn't looking to kill him. He was just looking to punish him. That's why they used this. This would still rend your flesh, but not the way the hooks did. But look, if you're sitting in a darkened movie theater and you're a director trying to make you feel the horror of the moment, how do you do that? With graphic, up-close rending of flesh in violent way. And Mel Gibson knew the scorpioni were not accurate, but he also knew that he wanted you to feel the horror of that, and it was pretty horrible. So what Mel had in the movie, again, Mel had artistic license. He was making a movie, not a documentary. But that's what a Roman flagrum looks like. So I know I've been very brief, and I haven't covered a lot of detail here. You can find a lot more of this on shroud.com. But I'm trying to kind of give you an overview of what we find on the shroud, and that it's all forensically accurate. And now I'm going to tell you, remember I said that they looked at a photograph of the shroud with this instrument, and it revealed these 3D properties? This is the device. Now I'm looking out here, and I'm seeing all adults, very few children, because I usually say this kind of looks like an old stereo tuner. Imagine saying that to a bunch of 10-year-olds. I had a 10-year-old put up his hand one day when we were talking about film, and he said, "Excuse me, Mr. Schwortz, film, is that a USB device?" I felt old at that moment, because he didn't know what film was. He was 10 years old, which means his recollection might have been to when he was 5. Well, in the last 10 years, film has become completely obsolete. So it's kind of tough. But this is what it looked like. This is the device, and the output of this device came up on a green screen. Now, there's the image I used, and this is footage off the screen of a real VP8 image analyzer, the same device that was used at Sandia Labs that became the catalyst for our team being formed. When they saw these properties, they said, you know, let's put a team together, see if we can get permission, and let's go over to Turin and examine this and try and figure out how an image gets encoded with 3D or spatial information. Now, it's a little hard to see, but you can see you can turn up and down the gain. Down on this one, you can see you can rotate it and look at the face. You can see the swollen cheekbones. Now, what's unusual, this is a rather crude image. That 8 in VP8 stands for 8-bit, which means there's only 8 levels of gray, so it's not a very smooth-looking image. They've now used computers to make it smoother looking, but this I'm sharing with you is exactly what catalyzed our team to be formed and go over there and do what we did. Now, I always tell people at this moment in time that a normal photograph doesn't do that, and there's always somebody in the audience that says, yeah, well, show me. Okay. So when I was shooting this off the screen of a real VP8 in 1997, at my friend Kevin Moran's house in Charlotte, North Carolina, I said, Kevin, I'm going to tell people that normal photos don't do this. So I took a picture of his grandkids off the wall, put it in the VP8, and this is the result. By the way, those kids are both full grown now. It's been a while. Take a look. Let's just look at this for a minute and see why this isn't viable. Notice this little boy here. Notice that his hair is going down into his head. Notice that his eyes look like kind of a monster almost. Notice that his nose and cheeks are flat. Notice that his mouth is grossly distorted. And I don't even know what to say about the little kid on the right. There's nothing natural in the relief here. This is just a jumble that goes up and down, but it doesn't give you the natural relief of a human form like the Shroud does. And so this is what sort of prompted us to put this team together and go over there and do this. Now, we do live in a photographic world, or at least we did then, and we could go into a darkroom and apply a technique called photo relief or edge enhancement that did a similar thing than the VP8 did, but we weren't limited to just 8 levels of gray. Photographic material has a much broader range, and so you get a much smoother image here. Look at the face, the cheeks, the nose, the eyes, the brow, all of them properly in relief. Look at his hands crossed across his body. You can see the fingers, his knees, all the way to the feet, the back of his head, his shoulders, and of course some of these burns have gotten into the shoulder area, so they're not complete, all the way down to his calves and his feet. So this information's there. I've now shown you another way of looking at it, and I know we live in a digital age. Oh, and by the way, my friend Aldo Goreski, an Italian photographer, came up with the clever idea of putting his daughter in a photo with the Shroud and then applying that technique, that photo relief technique. Notice that she's not looking so good anymore. But the Shroud image does exactly the same thing that it's always going to do. That information's really there. And we even did a quick VP8 on this. Not great, but again, you can still see the natural relief here and nothing natural about Paola's face there. And we do live in a digital age, so here's a digital version that a gentleman in Malta sent me. He took one of my photos and created this in the computer. That information's there. It's really encoded into the image of the Shroud. And this is a pretty good example of that. So, our team spends 17 months planning. We decide that anything we do there has to be done non-destructively. We can't harm the cloth. So how are we going to support this so that we can study it and examine it? And the answer is very simple. We're going to build a table made of steel, and we're going to fasten the Shroud to it with magnets. That way we're not going to punch any holes in it or anything. So we build and design. There's the table. This is a month before we went over. We met as a team. We were working in groups. I was in the California group. There was a group in New Mexico. There was a group in Colorado. And there was a group in New England. That was where all our medical guys came from, most of them. And so we meet for the first time as an entire team 1 month before we go to Turin. And we meet in Amston, Connecticut, what we call the dry run. And this is not the Shroud, but a replica that we were using. But you can see the steel table, and that table can rotate so we can look at it vertically or flat. So we get this meeting, we get together, meet for the first time, and a month later, we go to fly over to Italy. Now, being this is a Catholic group, I can tell you this. There was no Pope when we examined the Shroud. Because the night before we took off, September 29th, John Paul I died. And John Paul II wasn't elected until the 13th or the 16th after we finished our examination. So there truly was no Pope at the time that we examined it, although we were still in Turin when the white smoke went up in Rome and we were all watching on TV and John Paul II was elected. So anyway, so we get over to Turin, and this is the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist where the Shroud has been since 1578. And behind it is the Guarini Chapel, built specifically to house the Shroud and its reliquary. And the square building behind that is the Royal Palace of Turin, where we ultimately examined the cloth. So we fly over to Turin, and the Shroud had been put on public display for the first time in 30-some years. So there was a public display going on, and we were going to get the shroud as soon as the public display ended. Now, I have to tell you, I was pretty amazed at how many people were there to see this piece of cloth. Remember, I wasn't enlightened then. And when I say there were a lot of people, I'll tell you what. Look, see this part of the photo over in this corner? Okay, let's look at that a little closer. Yeah. How would you like to wait in that queue for 10 hours, 100,000 people at a time, for about a 3-minute look at the most at the shroud? Now, the good news is since this public exhibition, there have been several others in 2000, in 1998 and 2000, then again in 2010. And there's something new that happened since this photo was made. It's called the internet. You might have heard of it. And now you make a reservation online, and there are no more long lines. When the shroud was on display last year, I went there. Basically, it took like 3 minutes to walk through the place to where you go in and see the shroud. Because now they tell you, make the reservation at the time you want to be there, and just show up on time, and there won't be any long queues. But that wasn't the case back then. Now, this is inside the cathedral. This is a glass wall looking into the Guarini Chapel. Sadly, I think it was 1997, pieces were falling out of the dome of it, so they shut it down, moved the shroud out into the cathedral itself, and they restored this beautiful chapel. Only problem was, before the scaffolding was taken down, an arsonist got in there, lit it all on fire, and destroyed the Guarini Chapel, damaged the palace and the cathedral. Fortunately, the shroud was rescued, and if you go to shroud.com, you can get a link to the video of them actually rescuing the shroud and rushing it out of the cathedral. It was rescued by a man named Mario Trematore, who was a volunteer fireman who lived near the cathedral. And he went running in there with a hat and a coat and a 9-pound hammer. And the shroud was behind 1-inch thick bulletproof glass. But nobody told Mario that a 9-pound hammer can't break bulletproof glass, so he smashed through the bulletproof glass and rescued the shroud. And afterwards he said, "Oh, it was simple." And we all looked at him and went, "Okay." Obviously, he was meant to be there to do that. And so he was able to do something that was impossible. Because it's a 9-pound hammer, it's not that big. Anyway, this is what you would see when you went in. You would come down the left side. You can barely see it, but there's some people standing there looking up at the shroud, and then they come out the right. They still show it pretty much the same way now. So that hasn't changed a lot. This is the Guarini Chapel and the altar, the beautiful altar, and behind this grating is where the silver reliquary box was kept. That's the reliquary. Now notice it's silver on the outside, wood on the inside. They would wrap it in red silk and then in asbestos. Not a good thing. So after the 97 fire, they started thinking about it and going, maybe a wooden box isn't the best thing to keep it in. So they had the Italian gas company put up $25 million and they designed this beautiful reliquary made of steel, fireproof, bomb-proof. The shroud isn't rolled up anymore like they did for centuries. It's kept flat. It's kept out of the polluted air of Turin. It's in an argon nitrogen atmosphere, just like the Declaration of Independence in Washington. Same idea. Kept flat and kept in the dark for all of the time that it's stored. It's only brought out during public exhibitions. Now, recently a lady sent me this from last year's exhibition. They don't use this anymore. This is that silver reliquary. It's now in the Shroud Museum, and she sent me this photo, and I asked her, "Oh, can I put this in my PowerPoint? That's a really nice photo." And now you can see it in a much better way, now that it's just a part of the museum now. Obviously, the shroud's not in it anymore. If you were to go to Turin today, this is what you'd see. This is in one of the niches in the front left of the cathedral. There's that big reliquary box. They can roll that out, and they pull the cover off and unlock it, and upraises the shroud out of it, still protected by the nitrogen-argon atmosphere, temperature and humidity controlled by computer. And if you were there this year, anybody go see it this year? No, bummer. This last year, I guess. So, oh, you did? Okay, so there's a few here who saw it. Yeah, I was there too, of course. I haven't missed, since '78, I've been there at every one. Anyway, this is what you'd see. And So now the Shroud is better protected than it's ever been in its history. So at least, but it took a near tragedy before they wised up and took it out of a wooden box and put it in something safer, and with modern technology to preserve it. So it's better preserved than ever before. I told you I was going to show you a picture of me and Secundo Pia's camera. Yeah, that's really me. See, I used to have a lot of hair, and it was black. Well, I still have a lot of hair, but it's sliding off the back now. So. But anyway, that's what he had to work with, and I used to laugh and say, oh, look, the modern technology next to both cameras are equally obsolete because they both use film. That's right. So that's what we were up against, okay? Poor Secundo Pia. So we get to Turin. We get off the plane, and the first news they give us is, all your equipment's been seized by Italian customs. Seized. Well, we had 80 crates of equipment. And so why was it seized? Because we had a X-ray machine with us. And on the outside of the X-ray machine was a radiation sticker. Apparently put the fear of God into the Italian customs folks because they seized all of our equipment and refused to release it. Now, we'd gotten there a week early, so that while the public exhibition was still going on, we could get all our equipment unpacked and set up and calibrated in the Royal Palace. So when it came time for us to actually physically examine it, we'd be all ready to go. So that 5 days go by and our equipment's not released. Now, remember I mentioned the Holy Shroud Guild, the 4 priests in New York? One of those priests was Father Peter Rinaldi. Father Peter was born in Turin, was an altar boy at the Turin Cathedral, and in 1933 saw the Shroud for the first time on public display. That's why he became a priest, although there is a saint in his family, so it might have been part of the family tradition anyway. Can't attribute it directly to the Shroud, but that's when his interest began in the Shroud. And so Father Peter, after 5 days and nights, since he was Turinese, he knew how to get things done in Turin. He says, I will go and I will get it out. He goes down to the customs office. And he says, okay, anyway, let me stop right there. And let me point out that for those 5 days and nights, they let us in the palace, even though we couldn't do anything because all the equipment was gone. But I had some of my cameras. So since I'm from Pittsburgh, not too many palaces in Pittsburgh, I decided while I'm here, I'm going to make some photographs of the Royal Palace. So this is from the room we examined the Shroud, looking down the hallway, which was our storage area, we called it. This is the fresco in what we called the equipment maintenance room. Had been a bedroom for visiting royalty when the palace was a palace. By the time we got there, sorry about that, by the time we got there, it was already a museum. And so I just did this for myself. And this is the fresco in the room in which we examined the Shroud. This is what we saw when we looked up. Now remember, I made these just for myself, right? But after the fire in 1997, these rooms of the Royal Palace were damaged by water and smoke. And I was given the privilege of meeting with the Archbishop of Turin and presenting him a set of prints that could be useful, perhaps to restore these back to the way they used to be. That's how God does it. You know what I mean? I took them just for fun of it, right? But they became important 20 years later. That's what we saw. So finally, Peter Rinaldi goes down to the customs office. And he goes into the customs office and he said, oh, who's the man in charge? So the guy comes out, I'm in charge, Father, what can I do for you? He says, what is your name? Now the guy's suspicious, because Father Peter's a big guy and kind of an imposing guy. He says, well, why do you want to know my name, Father? He says, there will soon be an international incident and I want to give you credit for it. Then he slipped him 100,000 lira and the equipment was immediately released. Father Peter knew how to get things done in Turin. And it sounds like a lot of money, 100,000 lira, 80 bucks. Just don't get too excited. That's why the Italians were very happy to get off the lira and onto the euro, because if you did shopping in Italy before they went on the euro, the prices were 1.7 million lira. You know, they looked like they were ridiculous, but you have to divide it all by 80, and then you're close. So anyway, they released the equipment, loaded on this dump truck. And this is in the courtyard of the Royal Palace. And I'm making this photo and thinking any second the guy's going to pull the lever and just dump our stuff out. Somebody actually ran up to the driver and said, don't dump the equipment out. And he looked at it, of course not. You guys unload it. So we unloaded the equipment and we moved it into the Royal Palace on our own. As you can see, we're just loading all these cases in there. And there's our table. And you can see these markers around the end. These are like map coordinates so that we could precisely mark where we were going to look. And that's me peeking my head around the edge there. Now, I used to say, look at this modern equipment next to this 400-year-old tapestry. Now, I have no idea what that piece of equipment is, but I'll bet you $1 your phone has an app for it now. But this was high-end, high-tech stuff in 1978. Here we are unloading some of the camera gear. We had a lot of it with us. There's the equipment maintenance room. Speaking of which, notice the parquet wooden floors. Notice the garden hoses running through there. Why would we need that? Well, we had one piece of equipment that needed to be water cooled, and the nearest water, let me back that up for a sec. I'm looking into the room from the doorway. To my left is a hallway, and at the far end of that hallway is the only operating bathroom in the Royal Palace section that we were in. So, to keep this piece of equipment cool, we had to run out and buy a bunch of garden hoses, string them all together, from all the way down at the end of the hall from the bathroom, all the way up through the equipment maintenance room, through this door, and into the room in which we examined the Shroud, and there you can see them coming in. And there's that fresco I showed you earlier. Okay, well, I'm sorry, I'm going backwards here. We also were going to do infrared or thermal imaging, so we had to cover up all the windows with foil. Now, this is where these men shined. Sadly, 2 of the 3 men in this photo have already passed away. Vern Miller, my dear friend, was the chief scientific photographer. Don DeVan, the guy I did the atomic bomb project with, he's passed away as well. This is not me, that's Sam Pellicore, an optical physicist who was on our team. And what these guys are doing, you're setting up the camera support system. You know, you got a 14.5-foot long piece of cloth. Well, if you set up your camera and you want to photograph it, you don't want to move the camera, you want to keep the distance precisely the same. So they were setting this up, they're measuring the distance, we sandbagged the camera rail into place, the support system, and I could then slide the camera along that, and the distance between the cloth and the camera were always the same. 20 years later, I was able to have the photographs I made. I photographed the Shroud in 2 halves. 20 years later, we had them digitized. I put them into Photoshop, composited them, perfect match, because these guys thought to do that all those years ago. We were there to do serious science. Anybody been to Italy at all? Or even, oh, most of you, wonderful. Then you know that nothing ever happens on time in Italy. When we were there was a train strike, so the Rapido train was 2 hours late, but they were very proud that the Rapido Espresso was only 1 hour late, which is a different mentality than we might have here. So imagine our surprise when an hour ahead of schedule somebody yelled, "Here comes the Shroud," and sure enough, go running out into the hallway. There's the back door to the Guarini Chapel. Remember I said they join each other, Cathedral, Chapel, Palace. Here's the back door of the Guarini Chapel into the Royal Palace. I go running out into the hallway. I'm putting the flash on the camera, which immediately makes young people laugh. I'm waiting for it to power up, turning on the camera, grabbing this shot, and I get this one shot off, and if you were to look real close, you'll see the only thing in focus is the wall back there. Sometimes, you know, you just grab it when you can get it. These guys are completely out of focus up here, but the wall is sharp. Anyway, the point is, sometimes when you're in the middle of a historic event, getting it perfect is less important than getting it. And at least I got it. So, they bring the Shroud in. We're still working to get our stuff ready, because remember, we lost 5.5 days of our 7-day prep period. And one of the things we discovered when we unpacked the table, the stainless steel had corroded. There was a white powdery stuff on the surface. But our guys anticipated that was a possibility. And remember, we had 2 NASA scientists, and they brought with them several rolls of gold foil mylar, the same stuff that you've seen in the cargo bay of the space shuttle and on satellites and stuff like that. That's your tax dollars at work, folks. NASA contributed to our work by allowing us this very expensive material. And the table had removable panels because we're going to shoot x-rays. You can't have a piece of steel in the way. So each of the panels had to be covered. And as you'll see, here they are already unwrapping the shroud. And if you look down here, you'll see a couple of panels hadn't even been covered yet because we'd lost all that time. But here they are unveiling the shroud to us. And this is the first look at the shroud. Now, there's a hidden story here. On the left are the Italian scientists. On the right are the American scientists. The Italian scientists were not happy for us to be there at all. So they told us, okay, you can examine the shroud, but if you touch it, the carabinieri, the policemen in plain clothes, armed, guarding us, if you touch it, they're going to shoot you. We didn't know they were just messing with us. So notice on the left the Italian guys, and notice where the hands are of the American guys on the right. Hidden story, right? Obviously, you can't examine the shroud without touching it. Ultimately, we all did, and we all left our DNA on it. So my DNA is on it, too. So if they do an examination, they're going to find too much contamination for DNA to be viable on the shroud. Anyway, so here we are. So now we're looking at this thing, and there's the shroud stretched out and attached to a piece of white painted wood. How do you think they fastened the shroud to that piece of wood? Thumbtacks. So every place they put a thumbtack, obviously we had to remove the thumbtacks, every place they took out a thumbtack, you know what they found? That's what they're doing here. Little circle of rust with a rusty hole in the middle. They had to clean all those, and they did about 100 of those. So they kind of crucified the shroud, too. But we were just appalled. Here we are fabricating this big, heavy monster table so we'd cause no harm to the cloth. And they just punched a bunch of thumbtacks into it, and stretched it out, and put it on a piece of wood and hung it up for people to see. Fortunately, they don't do this anymore. But that's what they're doing. They're removing the thumbtacks. And here, we finally got the mylar onto the table so the shroud wouldn't be damaged. And we rotated it horizontally, and now we're going to unthumbtack the shroud, and we're going to move it from their piece of wood onto our stainless steel table, or steel table, not stainless steel, because there's some chemicals in stainless steel that could have been harmful, so we didn't use stainless steel. And here we are now. You can see all these white things around the edges here. Those are the magnets holding it in place. And there's the shroud. Now we're rotating it back up, and now we're prepared. Except because we're Americans, we couldn't go first. So they decided to allow this gentleman, Max Frey, very clever Swiss criminalist, gathered evidence at crime scene kind of guy. He came up with the idea of using sticky tape to lift debris off the clothing of crime scene victims. It was a very clever idea, very good idea. He was one of the pioneers of using that technique. But there's a problem. The Shroud of Turin is not the clothing of a crime scene victim. Well, it is, technically, but it's a lot more important. Once you've completely, thoroughly examined the clothing of a crime scene victim, they put it in a bag, put it on a shelf, and nobody cares after that. Shroud's a little different than that. So Max Frey, on his way to the palace that day, obviously stopped off and bought the cheapest roll of dime store sticky tape he could find. Now, we had tape experiments with us, but we went to a company called 3M. Might have heard of them. And they manufactured a tape that would leave no gummy residue on the shroud. And not only that, for the technical minded, the mylar backing had specific optical properties to allow for polarized light microscopy without having to take the debris and stuff lifted out of the gum. Max Frey just used the cheapest tape possible, and he started pushing it down, and look what he was doing. Look at that. We were appalled. Exactly. We just couldn't believe it. And then Max takes his dime store tape and he's going over to the face, the most iconic, important part of the image, perhaps. And he's ready to put it down on the face when John Jackson, one of the co-founders of our team, runs over, grabs Max and literally pulls him away from the shroud. And if it looks like they're about to hit each other, and the man in the middle, Professor Ganella, who's the scientific advisor to the Archbishop, if it looks like he's acting as a referee, that's exactly what's going on. They almost came to blows. And it was decided after a few minutes of heated discussion, nobody put any tape on the face. Not us, not Max. But we were pretty appalled. Anyway, Max is finished. He finishes his, and we're all just kind of breathing a sigh of relief. And then Professor Rigi comes in. He was given 2 weeks' notice. The Americans are coming. We want an Italian to go ahead. So you have to come up with something. You got 2 weeks. We spent 17 months. Professor Rigi spent 2 weeks and came up with some brilliant science. Professor Rigi says, you know, there's a backing cloth that was sewn on after that 1532 fire. So nobody's seen the backside of the shroud in 450 years. He decides to separate the backing sheet from the shroud, small area, and insert between the two an endoscopic camera system. Very clever. And a vacuum, so he could vacuum any debris that might be in there. So here they are separating the shroud from its backing cloth. There you go. And I'm making this photo and realizing, wait a minute, in a few seconds, we're going to see the backside of the shroud for the first time in 450 years. So I ran around to the other side just to be prepared and made what is probably the most famous photograph I made in 1978. Life, National Geographic, all these places. And this one's in focus. Yeah, I got this one right. And that is precisely the moment that we saw the backside of the shroud for the first time in 450 years. I don't know what the sister was thinking, but she was not thrilled. That much I could see. And my heart went out to her, because here are all these scientists kind of poking and prodding at the shroud, and her job was to care for it. So my heart went out to her, and I made this photo capturing that second. I don't know what was going through her mind, but I think it's obvious she was a little distressed. Those are her hands, and you can see she's lifting a sample, not a very large piece, but a little piece of fiber, and that wasn't for us, that was for the Italians. Now Rigi finally gets everything ready, and he separates the two, and they're putting in a brass thing that kept the cloth separate from the backing sheet so they could put stuff between it. And there's his vacuum. That's not the kind we use at home. It's a lab vacuum. And he had sterile filters up in the handle here. And he made a bunch of, vacuuming experiments in different parts of it. But because the stuff is loose debris, you don't know where it came from. There's no provenance to any particulates that you gather. So it didn't turn out to be that exciting of what he got. What about his endoscopic camera system? Now, that was a clever idea to see the backside of the shroud. The only problem is 1978, an endoscopic camera, which uses fiber optic bundle to transmit the image through it. Fiber optic bundles were so coarse that, you ever seen a photo taken through the eye of a fly? You know, it's a bunch of little circular bunches. That's kind of what it, so none of his endoscopic camera system images came out very well. They weren't usable. But Rigi, I'll show you how clever he was. If you don't mind, I'm going to jump down and sit down for a moment. My back's starting to bother me, and you don't need to see me. What's important's up there. So Rigi knows that his camera can see a circular image about 10 centimeters in diameter. So how are you going to know what you're looking at from underneath? Well, the camera system has a focusing light. And he had a string grid made of 10 centimeter squares that he could lay over a landmark, in this case, the epsilon or number 3 blood stain on the forehead. And when he turned on his focusing lamp underneath, now he knew exactly what he was going to see. Now that's so simple and so brilliant and so elegant. You have to admire his, remember, he had so little time to plan this. He did an amazing thing. And when he turned that focusing lamp on, we learned the first new thing about the Shroud of Turin that no one ever knew before. You see, that's the blood stain, and you notice that it's soaked into the cloth. So when we transmit light through it, it is darker or more dense than the surrounding areas. Now remember, the conventional wisdom in 78 was this was some kind of painting. Well, if it's a painting and we transmit light through it, just like the blood which soaked in, the paint would have soaked in, and if we photograph the entire shroud with transmitted light, if it's painted, we're going to see the paint, just like we see the blood. So they said to me, Barrie, we're going to put 30 minutes into the schedule for you to photograph the entire shroud with transmitted light. There it is, folks. So what do we see? Well, look, we see the blood stains, the spear wound blood stains. Sorry, the ones at the head are kind of washed out by the light. I didn't put the lights in, they just drew them back there real quick. Look, even the water stains are showing up, because as the water by capillarity spread out, it carried with it dust, debris, and dirt, and at the peripheral of the water stain, all that stuff got collected, and so it makes density, so even the water stains around the edges are visible transmitted light. What don't we see? We don't see the image, do we? Because it's not a painting, folks. And there's the evidence, there's what the image looks like, and there's what it looks like with transmitted light. That was the first new thing we learned about the Shroud, that if there's paint on it, it didn't even penetrate into the cloth. And of course, we now know that the image is on the first several microns of the top surface fibers and no deeper than that. It didn't penetrate the cloth. There's no way that a paint or a pigment or a dye or any kind of hand-applied artistic medium wouldn't show up with transmitted light. Even watercolors would have shown up. That's not what we have on the Shroud. The Shroud is not a painting, and this was the first hard evidence to support that. Now, rather than rattle off a bunch of big names and put you completely to sleep, I decided I would show you the instruments and tell you the tests those instruments were there to perform. This is not an academic lecture. I'm trying to keep you awake. So I'm going to show you these technologies. I'm going to show you what these instruments are for so that we can get through this and into some of the other stuff. Now, that woman is Marty Gilbert. She and her husband owned the Oriel Corporation. They made the best spectral instruments in the world. Governments from all over the world, NASA, everybody bought instruments from them. They were on our team and brought their finest spectral instruments with them. By today's standards, they're museum pieces, but in those days, this was state of the art. X-radiography. There's the little devil that cost us those 5 days. And that is an X-ray machine. Now, you know, if you go to the dentist and he puts that little thing in your jaw and he says, okay, hold it, click, click. It's about 1 second exposure, right? Well, this is a very low power X-ray for the reason that X-rays could be harmful. So they used a very low power X-ray. Each exposure was 20 minutes in length. Well, there's a problem with that. Remember those parquet wooden floors I showed you? Well, they were 400 years old. And when you walked around on them, the whole thing vibrated. So they had to, and worse yet, traffic was routed right next to the building in 1978. Not anymore. Now they have the piazza sealed off and there's no traffic next to the palace. But every time a truck or a bus went by, the whole building vibrated and dust fell. And so when they did the X-rays, they had to do it in the middle of the night when there was no traffic. And we all had to leave the room, and the poor guy who made the X-rays had to stand there for 20 minutes without moving his feet, or he would blur the X-ray. Now, there's another problem with X-rays. So you expose the X-rays of the Shroud, and then what? You put them back in the foil, and you bring them back through the airport X-ray machine? Probably not a good idea. So we had to bring a processor with us, an X-ray processor. Okay. So this is actually one of the X-rays, and there's the one that they're actually looking at there, and here we see it again. So what do you do if you're going to have to process an X-ray? You need two things. You need a room that can be made completely dark, and you need a water supply. So folks, when you're in the deepest, darkest part of the jungle, you just have to improvise. The only working bathroom became the dark room. And every time they had to process film, they would come into the room and go, anybody need to go to the bathroom? Just like we do with the kids when we're going to take a road trip. And they did that every time they had to process film. And through all that thick and thin, they got 42 X-rays made, which is pretty amazing. But always in the middle of the night, in the dead of night, when it was dead quiet. But hey, you do what you have to do. Not exactly the lab setting that you might have expected. Now, we also did photomicroscopy, photographs through a microscope. Let me just check my time. Okay. This is one of them. Notice the blood is still reddish in color. That's what kept me from accepting the Shroud's authenticity for another 17 years. Because old blood's supposed to turn black or brown, and it does it pretty early, pretty quickly, sometimes within an hour or even less. Why is the blood on the Shroud still red? Well, that was a deal breaker for me, because old blood's supposed to be black or brown. It wasn't until 17 years later when Dr. Alan Adler, the blood chemist on our team, and I were on the telephone. And Al said, you know, we were talking and something came up and I said, well, you know, I'm still not convinced about the blood because it's still red. And he said, he got upset with me. Didn't you read my paper? I said, Al, you're a chemist and I'm an old hippie photographer. There's a big difference there. And even if I read it, I might not have completely grasped what you were saying. He said, well, if you'd read my paper, which I had, he said, you would have found that I found a very high content of bilirubin in the blood. Now, bilirubin is not a Jewish guy from New York. It's actually a chemical manufactured in your liver, but it sounds like a Jewish guy from New York. And he found this bilirubin, a very high content. Now, bilirubin is typically generated under duress and stress. Remember, Jesus was beaten starting the night before. Then he was scourged and all the things they did to him. And so that's one of the reasons. But when Al told me that, I had to believe him because he was one of the other Jewish guys on our team. No, he was a true blood expert. So I realized at that moment that was sort of the last piece of the puzzle for me. Although in later years, Ray Rogers, the chemist on our team, determined that the shroud, when it was manufactured, was most likely rinsed or soaked in something called saponaria, soapwort. It's a naturally occurring detergent that acts like a fabric softener because linen is kind of stiff, not like cotton, which is very soft. And so they would use this soapwort or saponaria, and that would then it would be rinsed and dried in the air, which means dried by evaporation, which means a surface deposit of this saponaria residue, which, by the way, for the chemists in the room, is a pentose sugar. There would be a surface coating of that on these fibers, and saponaria is a hemolytic agent, just like bilirubin is. They break down the cell walls of the red blood cells, keeping it red forever. So there's two reasons why the blood is red, not just one. But I didn't know the second one at the time, but when Al Adler told me that, I realized that was the last piece of the puzzle for me. And it was then, and this was 1995, that's when I came to believe the shroud 100% in my heart. I believed it authentic. Now, not long after that, I got a phone call from a friend of mine who said, you know that shroud thing you're involved with? And I said, yeah. He said, well, it turns out it's just a photo made by Leonardo da Vinci. I did the same thing you did. I laughed. I thought he was just having me on. He was joking. I said, I laughed. He said, no, I'm serious. I said, really? I said, where did you get that information? Well, my wife and I were checking out at the grocery store on a tabloid. And that's when I had an epiphany. Frankly, that's when God reached down, smacked me upside the head and said, now here's the real job. Because at that moment in time, I realized that I was privileged. I had all the inside information. I was part of this. So I took for granted everybody knew what I knew. But that's not the case at all. The public wasn't getting accurate information. I had been offended a dozen times by media reports about our team, about our science, about our work, about the shroud. And at that moment in time, I had an epiphany and I realized, and I had a manila folder on my desk and I wrote 4 words, consider building a website. That's when God reached down and said, here's the job. And that's what led to the creation of Shroud.com, a place where I could share this information, because which of you reads scientific journals? Anybody out there? Maybe a few, if you're a researcher perhaps, but most people don't. They needed a place, and the internet was very new. I mean, we just turned 20 years old. People always make a big deal. Hey, you know, you're #1 on Google. And I always say, you know, we're 4 years older than Google, right? Because we are. And so that was sort of the genesis of the website. So continuing on here, I'm going to go through these quickly because I want to get to, oh boy, it's already 8:45. God, I can't believe it. Here's one of the other tests we did. This is ultraviolet fluorescence photography. Now, that's the spear wound. You can clearly see the shape of the wound and then the blood flowing out of it. If you look around the edges of that wound, can you see a lighter little halo? Well, let me point to it. See that little halo going around there? That's ultraviolet fluorescence photography reveals a serum stain around the blood stain that's completely invisible under white light and to the naked eye. So this medieval artist obviously hid that there, hoping that someday, 500 or 600 or 700 years later, we'd invent a technique to be able to see that. And if you believe that, I got a bridge I can sell you in Brooklyn, but... So what I'm showing you is that the science shows otherwise. There I am making my photographs as I've shown you. And there's the camera rails. Oops, sorry. There's the camera rail there. You can see I could slide the camera along that. This is one of the other tasks I was assigned, which was to create a map of where all the other guys took their data from. So since we were already using magnets to hold the shroud there, we got some little magnets. And by the way, you notice that those magnets were all white because they were coated in Teflon to leave not even one particle of metal on the shroud. They were sealed in Teflon, which is inert. And so these magnets were also sealed in Teflon. Okay? And so you can see the blood flow here, and the blood stain, the blood flow, and the little magnets from which I had to create a series of maps. Now you can go to shroud.com on the internet and you'll find them, and they're easier to see than this one here. And of course there's a key that tells you what you're looking at. And I had to make 8 of these maps, and it took 3 months in the darkroom to do it. Today in Photoshop I could do it in 2 days. But we didn't have Photoshop in 1980. So we did it the old-fashioned way with pin registration and acetate overlays and all this other stuff that I won't bore you with. But this is part of my responsibility for the shroud. Now, we also had sticky tape samples. I already told you that 3M manufactured that for us, and they did a brilliant job. And Ray Rogers, instead of using his thumb the way Max Fry did, designed a steel applicator, custom-sized for the tape 3M provided. And it was a torque applicator. You can see the pointer and the scale. It's a little hard to see in this photo. So he could apply a known amount of pressure evenly on his tape instead of the thumb that Max Fry used. And not only that, when you peel it off the shroud, he knew that any dust and debris would be sort of sticking out of the gum. So if you put it down on a glass, what's going to happen? It's going to embed all that deep into the gum of the tape, which he didn't want. So he designed and had fabricated special well slides. You can see the tape samples are just touching at the edges, and there's a couple of millimeters there of space. All this was planned in advance, folks. We took all this with us. This was very serious science. So when you hear that our team was a bunch of religious fanatics, I'm proof that it wasn't, okay? Because I walked away from Judaism when I was 13. When I say I walked away from everything, including God. And in a minute, I'll tell you how that ends. Now, we also had a computer. And look what it did. It did this. And that's all it ever did. For 5 days and nights, poor Bob Ewing, the poor guy back there, couldn't get it to do anything but that, but it did that pretty well, I guess. There's the computer. It's an MSI 8080. The 8080 depicts the chip that's inside. By the way, this was a kit. He had to build the computer first. And that 8080 chip, you know those little 50-cent stick-on clocks, magnetic clocks we put on the fridge, and when the battery dies, we just throw it away and get another one? That's the chip that's in this computer. Yeah, and that is an 8-inch floppy disk drive underneath. Imagine explaining that to 10-year-olds. And sadly, he couldn't get it to do anything else but that. But I did like the little red and blue switches. I thought that was a nice touch. Again, I have no clue what those were for. Now, it looks like I'm not going to go into the in-depth radiocarbon dating that I would have liked to talk to you about, but time just isn't going to allow it. So I'm going to show you our final report, and then I'm going to sort of answer some of the questions that I posed at the beginning. I already told you I walked away from Judaism. At age 13, I saw the hypocrisy. I promised my grandfather that I would have a bar mitzvah, so I did, and then I was done. I never looked back until I was, again, about age 55 in the mid-90s. I built Shroud.com. I started speaking publicly about the Shroud of Turin, and people started asking me a new question, one that you're already thinking about. What do you believe? And you're not talking about the Shroud, you're talking about faith. Well, I had walked away from it and hadn't thought about God until I was in my 50s. All of a sudden, because I am compelled to be honest with you, that's the whole purpose of what I do and the purpose of the website. It's certainly not my place to tell other people what to believe, because I didn't even know what I believed myself. Look at what it says on Shroud.com. I wrote it 20 years ago. It says, given the facts, you have to make up your own mind about this. But here I am suddenly confronted with these questions, and I want to be honest with people, and I didn't have a clue what I believed. God had not been a part of my life since I was 13. And I've been in many synagogues. You ready for this? I've attended a Mass in the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Okay? Many of my Catholic friends are very envious of that. Also Masses in Bethlehem, Nazareth, Magdala. So I've been exposed to the most beautiful cathedrals, churches, and most holy places. I've been in synagogues in Rome and in the United States. None of them made me feel close to God. And yet, I knew that I had to answer the question honestly, and I didn't know what I believed. I didn't know if I believed in God even. Even though I was raised in an Orthodox home, my mother and father both born in Poland, our grandparents lived with us. You know, Fiddler on the Roof kind of a deal. Same idea. God was part of everything every day. So here I am trying to find God in all these buildings and these cathedrals and the synagogue, and it didn't work. But one day I just sat myself down and I said, look, got to come up with an answer to this question, because you got to be honest with people. You got to tell them what you believe. And for the first time, I looked inside myself to try and figure out what I believed. And that's when I found God. And I remember saying that to a priest. I don't believe it was Father Dave, another priest. And I said, you know, I looked everywhere for God, and when I finally found him, it was inside me. He'd always been there just waiting for me to acknowledge. And he said, you know what? That's what Jesus said. The kingdom of God is within us. And I said, you're right. That's where I found him. So now I can say that I'm a man of God now. How many Jews can say that the Shroud of Turin led them back to their faith in God? I can. Okay? So what's a nice Jewish boy like me doing involved with the most important relic of Christianity? It took all those years, and I finally figured it out. See, I was looking at why I was on that team, and I was looking, it was supposed to be about me, and I couldn't figure out why I was there. That's because I wasn't in that room for me, folks. I was in that room for you. Isn't it funny how God always picks a Jew to be the messenger? I'm just a messenger, folks. Yeah. And so now, I'm going to share something my little Jewish mother said. She passed away about 1.5 years ago at age 92, so she had a good long life. She died in her sleep. She lived in her own place until 4 days before she passed, and she died with no pain. I should be so lucky when my time comes. About 10, 15 years ago, I was back in Pittsburgh for a reunion. And my Catholic friends there said, look, give a talk. The diocese said, well, we'll give you a place to speak. They put me on the radio with Father Lengwin. Anybody been back there? You know who he is. And so my mother and my brother and my cousins, and you know how Jews are, and Italians and Christians, all the relatives came to hear me speak. Big crowd like this. Did my talk. We're driving back afterwards. And my mother's silent. And when a Jewish mother's silent, be afraid. Be afraid. And so finally, I couldn't stand the silence, and I turned to her and I said, okay, what do you think? And then she turned to me and she said, well, of course, it's authentic. And I'm shocked. This is a little lady born in Poland, immigrated as a child, high school education, not a very sophisticated woman. And she said, I said, Mother, what makes you say that? What makes you say it's authentic? And she looked at me, and then she got that Jewish mother tone. You know, Barrie? They wouldn't have kept it for 2,000 years if it belonged to anybody else. It wouldn't have mattered. And she was more than right. She was spot on, because it's against Jewish law to take that blood-soaked cloth out of the tomb. They put themselves at great risk to rescue this and keep it a secret for a couple of 100 years. The first depiction of Jesus looking like the man of the shroud, 285 AD in the Domitia catacombs in Rome. Before that, no trace of it, not mentioned in the Gospels other than that it was there. Now, perhaps the image wasn't visible, or perhaps they were fearful of revealing that it was there because there were iconoclasts looking to destroy any kind of Christian objects of any sort for the first 300 or so years. It shows up in a desk. I'm not going to go into the history. You can look at that up on Shroud.com. I'm just kind of giving you a quick overview here because basically I'm out of time. And what I really wanted to do is go into the radiocarbon dating, which everybody always asks about, but I've got 5 minutes left. So let me give you the quick overview of the radiocarbon dating. They dated it in '88. They proclaimed it was a fake, even though they didn't explain anything about the image. They took one little piece from one little corner, divided it in thirds, and each lab got a little piece. And they dated that corner. And for 12 years, the world said, well, Shroud's a fake, move on. 12 years later, a non-scientific couple that had been studying the Shroud took some photos of the samples that had been cut to a textile expert. Textile expert looks and goes, oh, look, some reweaving going on here. This is one of the actual carbon dating samples they're looking at a photo of. So they went, okay, thank you, and they went to another textile expert, not trusting that one. Same thing. Oh, look, somebody's manipulated this. There's some reweaving going on here, but only a trained expert would even notice it. Well, they didn't accept it, so they went to Thomas Ferguson Irish Linen, the world's foremost experts on linen. And their number one expert looked at it and said, this has been rewoven. And it turns out, this is the very short version, turns out that the corner that they chose for radiocarbon dating was a corner where they used to hold the shroud. The bishops would hold it at either end, and it would wear, and eventually needed to be repaired. And in the 15th century in France, they perfected a technique called French invisible reweaving. Okay? And this was at the court of the French king, so, you know, they had the time and the money to be able to do this. It was very time-consuming and expensive. And that corner was repaired. And all they dated was a medievally repaired corner of the Shroud. And the details are on Shroud.com. I would love to give you the whole spiel, but you don't want to be here for another 30 minutes. So in the end, well, maybe you do, I don't know. But I don't think the folks who run the place want me to be here for another 30 minutes. So look, in the end, the most important part of my message is simply this, that I started this off thinking it's just a gig. I'm a photographer, it's a photo shoot, done deal, walk away when you're done. By the way, nobody was paid. I had to go to the bank and borrow $1,000 so I'd have some money to go with me. Okay? And you should have seen the banker when I mentioned the Shroud of Turin. He goes, yeah, whatever. You're a nice guy, I'll loan you $1,000, no problem. So he didn't have a clue. So through all this whole thing, I was looking in all the wrong places for the answer, and the answer was right there in front of me the whole time. Like I said before, I wasn't there for me. I was there for you. Because God knew that 30 years down the road, I could do this. But I didn't. When I first took a public speaking class when I was in college, 12 people, my voice was trembling. I could barely talk. Hard to believe now, isn't it? Okay? So in the end, look, let me thank you so much for your time and your attention. I don't think there's time for questions, but you know, you can send us an email. I get a couple hundred a day. Be patient for an answer. If it's urgent, call me. The number's on the website. I thank you so much for your attention. I love you. God bless.